Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with creamy pork stew. That's right, do not let the generic name fool you. While this recipe might sound a little simple, the flavors are quite complex, incredibly comforting, and extraordinarily delicious. And while I really was thrilled with how this came out, it's also a very adaptable recipe and will work beautifully with all those gorgeous fall and winter vegetables at our disposal. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to begin by cutting up some pork shoulder. And there you can see mine. I got about a 2.5 pound piece, which was sold as a pork shoulder roast. And if you look carefully, you can still see the string marks where it was all tied together. And what we'll simply do here is take a sharp knife and cut this into about 2-inch pieces, give or take. No one's going to measure, but you want to get them close so they cook evenly. If you do happen to see a natural separation between the muscles, like we had here, you can cut through that first. But it really doesn't matter. Just start cutting into about 2-inch thick slices, and then cut those pieces into about 2-inch chunks. And I don't want you to worry too much about trimming fat off. I mean, if you see a piece hanging off that's just pure fat, go ahead. But as you may have heard me say before, I'd much rather skim than trim. So a lot of that fat's going to render out, and we can skim it off the top as it's stewing. And by the way, have I ever told you guys never ever buy pre-cut stew meat? That pre-cut stuff in the meat case is going to be more expensive and not as good. So don't use it. We're going to cut our own just like this. At which point we want to season this thoroughly with kosher salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper. And don't be shy, that's a lot of meat. So we'll season that generously, and then let's go ahead and give that a toss, solely for the purposes of salt and pepper distribution. And as soon as that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and move to the stove, where we want to brown this meat very thoroughly in a little bit of vegetable oil over high heat. And because I have about 2.5 pounds of pork, I don't want to crowd this, so I'm going to do mine in 2 batches. You will only be seeing one, but the second batch, remarkably similar to the first batch. And of course, one of the reasons we brown meats before we stew them is to add flavor, but it's also almost always going to give your sauce a better color. But that's really up to you. You are the disco stew of this stew's hue. But I assume you want it to taste great and have a beautiful color, so I do recommend a fairly thorough browning. And then once we feel like our pork has been browned beautifully, we will remove that to a bowl to rest. We will turn our heat down to medium, and then right in that same pot, in that beautiful pork fat, we will cook an onion, which as you can see has been roughly chopped. And we'll cook that stirring on medium for about 3 or 4 minutes, or until it starts to turn translucent, and those edges start to get a little bit golden. And then once that's happened, we'll go ahead and throw in some minced garlic. And as usual, we'll only cook this for about a minute stirring. And as you can see on the bottom there, we got a beautiful fond forming, which we are now about to deglaze with 2 of the most important ingredients. So once our garlic is cooked for about a minute, we're going to go ahead and dump in some vinegar. I'm using apple cider, but any wine vinegar will work also, as well as some apple cider. And we'll go ahead and stir that in. And now at this point, it's safe to raise our heat back up to high, because eventually all this has to be simmering. And while we're waiting for that to happen, we can go ahead and add a few more key ingredients. So at this point, we're going to introduce 2 big nice spoons of Dijon mustard. And of course, you can go ahead and use any style of mustard you want here, as long as it's Dijon. We also want 1 nice big spoon of horseradish, extra hot prepared horseradish, preferably homemade. Oh yeah, we have a video for that. So a nice shot of horseradish, and we'll stir that in. And at this point, we can dump our browned pork chunks back in, with any and all accumulated juices. I mean, you have to add those back in. That's mandatory. And then, of course, to make any kind of decent creamy stew, we need some cream. So I'm going to pour in about 1.25 cups of heavy cream. I believe that's 32% butterfat, if I'm not mistaken. But don't quote me on it. I'm not that great with percentages. I'm only right about 40% of the time and wrong about 70%. But anyway, we're going to add our cream. And then once we've added the cream, I am going to do a little splash of chicken broth. We kind of want that liquid level just coming up to the top of the meat. And then while we're waiting for this to come up to the simmer, we can go ahead and add some herbs. And for this, I'm going to use a little bit of sage. Those are just some little tiny sage leaves I picked off. And I'm also going to do a few thyme sprigs and a little bit of rosemary. So those are going to be the fresh herbs I use. But we're also going to add 1 dried bay leaf. And we'll stir all that in. And you will note I did not pick and chop those fresh herbs. What I'm going to do is add them whole like that, and after this is done simmering, those stems are going to be easy to pull out, leaving the herbs in the stew. And I think I'm also going to give it 1 more shot of salt here. And of course we're going to adjust later, but I do think we want to add some here. And then what we'll do is we'll wait for this to come up to a simmer. at which point we'll back the heat down to low, cover it, and let it simmer very gently on low for 30 minutes. At which point we'll take off the lid and we'll give it a stir. And that meat's not really going to be getting tender yet, so I'm not even going to check it. Basically, we were just giving it a little bit of a head start before adding the rest of our aromatic vegetables. So at this point, let's go ahead and add our celery and our carrots and stir those in. And once those were added, a little voice in my head said, hey, you may want to heat this up a little bit more. So I added a little more freshly ground black pepper, plus a little bit of cayenne, which I do enjoy now and then. And then the good news here, the rest of this recipe is extremely easy. Simmer this on low, stirring occasionally, until your meat is tender. And sure, if you want, you could skim some fat from the top. That's between you and your cardiologist. I may or may not have skimmed a little bit off. But we'll simply continue simmering until our meat is fork tender. And of course, you're not going to guess, or what some crazy people do, just go by cooking times listed in the recipe. You're going to check with a fork. And right here, I could tell mine was just about perfect. And once our meat is tender, we're going to toss in the last ingredient, a handful of green peas. And the peas are optional here, as are any vegetable additions. But I do enjoy them. So I stirred some in. And basically, we'll let that simmer for another 10 minutes or so, and we're probably done. Unless you decide on this one extra optional step. I like to turn up the heat and reduce it to thicken it up a little bit. So that's actually what you're seeing here. The stew's done, but I crank my heat to medium-high, and I'll cook stirring for another 4 to 5 minutes until everything just reduces a little more and thickens up slightly. And then once our meat is tender and we reduce the sauce to how we want it, you still, of course, have to check for seasoning, which I did, and I'm happy to report was perfect. So there was really nothing left for me to do except ladle this up over some rice. And like all great stews, this would be good served over anything. This is equally delicious over potato or pasta. Hey, you could probably even get away with serving this over quinoa, although you didn't hear that from me. And then for a little final touch, I decided to garnish with a little bit of fresh apple that I tossed with a little bit of fresh chive. I thought it would look pretty, plus provide a little bit of contrast with the temperature and the texture. And that's it. One of my favorite all-time winter stews is done. So let me go ahead and dig in. And that, my friends, is just such a delicious combination of everything. Taste, texture, temperature, just so good. I mean, as long as you season this properly and cook the meat until it's tender, there's absolutely no way to screw this up. Seriously. And I realize this time of year a lot of people are braising things in apple juice and cider, but it's been my experience that they use too much. We just used like a half a cup of cider, which gave us just the perfect amount of that background sweetness that we wanted. So I really did think this was perfectly balanced, to my taste at least. You, of course, are going to have to adjust to yours. All right? So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.